My name is Anna, I'm 32, and this happened on my father's birthday. I'm saying that up front because I didn't walk into that restaurant expecting drama. I wasn't bracing myself for a fight or a big emotional moment. I honestly thought it would just be dinner, cake, photos, maybe one awkward toast. Then I'd go back to my hotel and catch an early flight home the next morning. That was it. The restaurant was my parents' idea. One of those places that looks nicer than it actually is. Dim lights, white tablecloths, menus with prices you don't ask about out loud. They'd booked a private room because my dad wanted the family together. I got there early. That part won't surprise anyone who knows me. I checked in with the host, fixed a small issue with the seating chart when my aunt complained she was too far from my dad, and quietly paid the balance on the reservation because the server said the card on file had declined. I didn't announce it. I didn't mention it. I just handled it and sat down. That's always been my role. My parents arrived together. My mom hugged me quickly, already distracted, asking if the candles were ready. My dad smiled, relaxed, soaking in the attention like he always did on days that were about him. My sister showed up last. She was laughing before she even reached the table. Someone made a joke about her being fashionably late. Chairs scraped back so she could sit comfortably. Drinks were ordered for her without asking. Nobody minded. Dinner started off fine. Normal conversation, work updates, complaints about traffic. My sister talked a lot about how busy she'd been, how exhausted she was, how much she had on her plate lately. People nodded along, sympathetic. No one asked me how I was doing. I noticed that, but I didn't say anything. I rarely do. Halfway through the meal, my mom tapped her glass with her fork. That soft clink that means everyone should stop talking. She smiled and said a few words about family, about how lucky we were to all be together, about milestones. Then she turned toward my sister. "Didn't you want to say something?" she asked. My sister stood up immediately. She didn't look nervous. She looked prepared. She lifted her glass and waited for the room to quiet. And it did. Instantly. Every face turned toward her like this was exactly what they'd been waiting for. "I just want to say," she started, "that Dad taught me everything I know about responsibility." Something tight formed in my chest. She talked about stepping up, about being dependable, about always being the one people could count on when things got hard. She laughed a little, like it was humble and funny at the same time. Then she said it. "I've always been the responsible one in this family." The reaction was immediate. Applause, smiles. Someone said, "That's so true." My mom wiped at her eyes. My dad nodded, proud, lifting his glass toward her. I stayed completely still, because all I could hear in my head were the things no one in that room was clapping for. The electric bill I paid when the lights were about to be shut off. The rent I covered when someone was just short this month. The emergencies I handled quietly so nobody else had to panic. The plans I canceled because the family needed me available. None of that had ever happened in a room like this. None of it had ever come with applause. When the clapping started to fade, I leaned forward just a little. "I just want to—" My mom cut me off without even looking at me. "This isn't about you tonight," she said, smiling like she was smoothing over a minor inconvenience. Not angry, not sharp. Casual. The kind of tone that tells everyone else there's nothing worth paying attention to here. I leaned back in my chair. My sister sat down glowing. Conversation picked right back up. Dessert menus came out. Someone joked about the candles melting too fast. Laughter filled the room again like nothing had happened. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a story they had already agreed on. All the times I'd been told, "You're strong, you don't need help." All the times my sacrifices were framed as just what family does. All the times praise skipped right over me and landed somewhere louder. I used to think that meant trust. Sitting there, watching my sister accept praise for a role I'd been quietly playing for years, I finally understood what it really meant. It meant assignment. I wasn't responsible because anyone acknowledged it. I was responsible because they expected it. And expectations don't get applause. I smiled for the photos when they asked. But inside, something shifted. That dinner wasn't about celebrating my father. It was about confirming a version of the family where my contributions were never meant to be named. And for the first time, I realized my role hadn't just been overlooked. It had been rewritten. I didn't understand it that night at the restaurant. Not fully. I knew something was wrong, but it wasn't until later, back in my hotel room, shoes kicked off, dress still on, that the pattern started to come into focus. Because that dinner wasn't the beginning of anything. It was a reveal. Growing up, my sister and I were always described differently, even when we did the same things. She was under pressure. I was fine. She was doing her best. I was strong enough to handle it. If she forgot something, it was because she was overwhelmed. If I forgot something, it was out of character. I learned early that being low maintenance made adults relax. So I became very good at it. When my sisters struggled in school, my parents hovered. Tutors were hired. Meetings were scheduled. Everyone talked about how hard things were for her. When I did well, it was expected. When I struggled quietly, it went unnoticed. I wasn't the child who needed help. I was the child who removed problems from the room. As we got older, the roles hardened. My sister stayed close to home. She stopped by often. She talked about how tired she was, how much responsibility she carried. My parents heard that and translated it as effort. I moved away. I built a stable life. I didn't call every time something went wrong. So they translated that as ease. "You're doing great," my mom would say. "We never worry about you." At the time, I took that as love. Now I hear it differently. It wasn't that they trusted me more. It was that they needed me less, at least emotionally. And families tend to invest where they feel needed. When my sister needed reassurance, she got it. When she needed help, it was visible. When she needed praise, it fit the story they were already telling. When I helped, it happened quietly, usually over the phone, usually with a phrase like, "Can you just help us out this once?" Just this once. That phrase followed me for years. Just this once with the electricity bill. Just this once with rent. Just this once until things calmed down. Things never calmed down, but the requests kept coming. And every time I said yes without making it a big deal, I reinforced the same idea. I could handle it. So when my sister stood up at that dinner and called herself the responsible one, it didn't feel shocking to my parents. It felt consistent. Because in their minds, responsibility wasn't about outcomes. It was about visibility. My sister talked about stress, so she looked responsible. I absorbed stress, so it disappeared. And once something disappears, people forget it was ever there. That's the part that hurts the most to admit. No one erased me out of malice. They just got used to a version of me that worked in the background. The dependable one who didn't complain. The fixer who didn't ask for credit. The daughter who didn't need acknowledgement to keep showing up. I thought being easy to rely on would make me valued. Instead, it made me replaceable. That night, replaying the dinner in my head, I realized my sister's speech hadn't come out of nowhere. It had been rehearsed. Not out loud, but in 1,000 small moments where my role was assumed and hers was praised. Every time my parents said, "She's got so much on her plate." Every time they said, "You'll be fine. You always are." They weren't just describing us. They were assigning us. And once a family agrees on a story, it's almost impossible to interrupt it without becoming the problem. That's why my mom shut me down so quickly. "This isn't about you tonight." She wasn't protecting my sister. She was protecting the narrative. Because if I spoke, if I named what I had actually been doing, it would force everyone in that room to reconcile two versions of reality. And that's uncomfortable. Much easier to clap. Sitting alone in that hotel room, I finally let myself ask a question I'd avoided for years. What would happen if I stopped being the version of me that made everything run smoothly? Not dramatically, not angrily, just quietly. What would happen if the role they gave me stopped functioning? The thought scared me at first. Then it didn't. because for the first time, I realized something important. If my value in this family only existed when I was useful, then being less useful might be the only way to find out what was real. And once that question entered my mind, there was no way to put it back. The truth is, if you had asked my family what I contributed, they would have said I helped out sometimes. That's the phrase they liked, helped out. Sometimes. Sitting in that hotel room after the dinner, I opened my banking app without really meaning to. It was muscle memory at this point, the same way some people check social media when they're anxious. And that's when I started counting. Not dramatically, not to prove a point. Just counting. 3 years earlier, my mom had called me in a panic because the electricity bill was overdue and they'd gotten a shutoff notice. She was embarrassed. She whispered, like the power company could hear her through the phone. "Can you just cover it this once?" she asked. "We'll pay you back next month." I sent the money, $420. I didn't write it down. I didn't ask when next month came and went. A few months later, my sister needed help with rent. She'd had a rough patch at work. She was stressed. Everyone said she had so much on her plate. I wired $1,100 and told myself it was temporary. Then there was the car repair, the emergency dentist visit, the insurance deductible no one expected, the groceries that just had to wait until Friday. Every time, the ask came wrapped in urgency and guilt. And every time I said yes, what surprised me wasn't how much money I'd sent. It was how routine it had become. I scrolled back further. There were recurring charges I barely remembered agreeing to, streaming services in a house I didn't live in, phone plans I wasn't on, a storage unit, just for a little while. Even when I moved cities, even when I took on more expenses of my own, the requests didn't slow down. They just got quieter, more casual, like it was already assumed. What hurt wasn't the money. It was the fact that none of it had ever been framed as something I was doing. It was framed as something that was happening. Bills were just getting paid. Problems were just getting solved. By someone. Me. I remembered the conversations clearly. "You're so good with this stuff. You don't mind, right? You're the only one who can handle this." I'd mistaken that for trust. Now I see it was delegation. The night of my dad's birthday, while everyone clapped for my sister's responsibility, I realized something uncomfortable. No one in that room actually knew what responsibility looked like in practice. They knew what it sounded like. Stress, complaints, big speeches. But responsibility, the kind that keeps lights on and problems quiet, was invisible by design. Because the second it became visible, someone would have to acknowledge it. And acknowledgement changes expectations. I started listing things in my notes app, dates, amounts, what the money was for. Not because I planned to show anyone, because I needed to see it myself. There were months where I'd sent money 3 or 4 times without thinking twice. There were stretches where my account dipped lower than I was comfortable with, but I told myself it was fine. I was fine. I always was. That was the role. And the more I looked at the numbers, the clearer it became that this wasn't about a few favors. This was a system, one where my sister's stress was visible and therefore rewarded, and my effort was quiet and therefore expected. One where my parents didn't have to ask too many questions because someone else was filling the gaps. Me. I closed the app and sat back on the bed staring at the wall. For the first time, I felt something shift from sadness into resolve. Because if they could sit in a room and applaud a version of reality where I didn't exist, then I didn't owe that version my continued participation. I wasn't angry. I was done being anonymous in my own life. And that was when I made a decision I didn't tell anyone about. I wasn't going to argue. I wasn't going to confront them at the table. I wasn't going to demand credit. I was simply going to stop doing what I'd been doing in the background. No speeches, no announcements. Just a change. And I knew, deep down, that the moment I stopped holding everything together, the story they were so comfortable telling would start to crack. The strange thing is, I didn't plan to say anything that night. People assume moments like that come with rehearsed speeches, with anger building up until it spills over. But that's not how it felt. What I felt was pressure. The kind that builds quietly when you've been holding something for too long and suddenly realize you can't swallow it again. After my sister sat down, after the applause faded, there was this brief pause at the table. Plates were being cleared. Someone asked about dessert. The room shifted, settling back into comfort. That's when I leaned forward. It wasn't dramatic. I didn't stand up. I didn't raise my voice. "I just want to clarify something," I said. My heart was pounding, but my voice was steady. I remember noticing that, how calm I sounded compared to how loud everything felt inside me. For half a second, my mom looked at me, really looked. Not confused, not surprised. Cautious, like she was already deciding whether what I was about to say fit into the evening she had planned. I took a breath. "I've actually been the one handling— This isn't about you tonight," she said. She didn't wait for me to finish. She didn't ask what I meant. She didn't even lower her voice. She smiled when she said it. The kind of smile you use to smooth over a wrinkle before anyone else notices it's there. And just like that, the moment was gone. No one reacted. No one asked what I had been about to say. My dad kept looking at the menu. My sister shifted in her seat, relieved. Someone laughed about the cake being too big. It was like I'd never opened my mouth at all. I nodded, automatically. "Right," I said. "Sorry." The word came out of me before I could stop it. Conversation moved on immediately. That was the part that stayed with me later. Not the interruption, but how easily everyone accepted it. No awkwardness, no discomfort, no curiosity. Because in that family, I wasn't the one whose voice changed the room. I sat back and listened as if I were outside my own body. I watched my mom talk animatedly to my aunt. I watched my sister scroll through her phone, basking in the afterglow of approval. I watched my dad smile, satisfied, like the evening was unfolding exactly as it should. And in that moment, something finally clicked into place. This wasn't about timing. It was about permission. I had never been given it. All the years I'd told myself there would be a better moment to speak up, a more appropriate setting, a time when everyone would be more receptive. I saw how naive that had been. There was never going to be a moment where my truth fit comfortably into their story, because my truth disrupted it. I replayed my mom's words in my head. "This isn't about you. Not right now, not later, not we'll talk after dinner. Just never." I thought about all the other times I'd been gently redirected. "Let's not make this awkward. You know how she is. This isn't the time." Each one a way of keeping things smooth at my expense. I looked around the table and realized something else that hurt more than being cut off. No one looked uncomfortable. No one seemed to think it was unfair. They all understood on some level that this was how it worked. My role wasn't to be heard. It was to keep things moving. And the second I stopped doing that, even briefly, I was a problem to be managed. I stopped trying to follow the conversation after that. My mind drifted to all the times I'd swallowed words because I didn't want to be that person. The difficult one. The ungrateful one. The one who ruined the mood. I had spent years prioritizing peace over honesty, and it had cost me my voice. By the time dessert arrived, I already knew something had changed. Not outwardly. I smiled when the camera came out. I laughed at the right moments. I hugged my dad when everyone sang. But internally, the switch had flipped. Because being silenced publicly does something private. It forces you to decide whether you're going to keep waiting for permission that's never coming, or whether you're finally going to stop asking. That night, as we stood up from the table and people started saying their goodbyes, I realized something with painful clarity. They weren't going to acknowledge what I'd done. They weren't going to invite my version of events into the room. And if I wanted my life to look different, it wasn't going to start with another conversation. It was going to start with my absence. I didn't announce anything after that dinner. I didn't send a group text. I didn't schedule a call. I didn't confront anyone about being cut off. I just went home. And once I was back in my own space, my own apartment, my own quiet, I started noticing how much of my life had been shaped around problems that weren't actually mine. The first thing I did was open my laptop. Not out of anger, out of habit. I pulled up old emails, bank statements, documents I hadn't looked at in years because there had never been a reason to. Everything was neatly organized, folders labeled by year. Another habit I'd developed without thinking. As I clicked through them, something became painfully obvious. My family had asked me for help a lot. They had never once asked me what that help looked like. They never asked how I managed it. They never asked what it cost me. They never asked what I'd signed or agreed to along the way. They assumed it was simple because I made it look that way. 3 years earlier, when my parents were struggling to refinance their house, my dad had asked if I could just look over the paperwork. He didn't understand the terms. The bank was pressuring them. Everything felt urgent. I didn't just look it over. I spent hours on the phone with the lender. I negotiated a temporary solution. I signed documents as an authorized contact because it was faster that way. That authorization was supposed to be temporary. No one ever followed up to change it. There were other things like that. Utilities transferred into my name for convenience. Automatic payments set up from my account just until things stabilize. A small loan I co-signed because it's basically already approved. Every decision made sense in isolation. Every one of them had been framed as a favor, but taken together, they told a different story. I wasn't just helping. I was quietly positioned as the backstop, the safety net no one talked about. What struck me the most wasn't how much responsibility I'd taken on. It was how little anyone had ever asked about it. My sister had never once asked how the bills got paid when things were tight. My parents never checked in to see if I was okay taking on more. They just assumed. Because I didn't complain. Because I didn't ask for recognition. Because I always said, "It's fine." The night of my dad's birthday, when my mom told me it wasn't about me, I don't think she was trying to hurt me. I think she genuinely didn't see me as someone who needed space in the story. I was infrastructure, invisible until it stopped working. I closed my laptop and sat there for a long time, staring at the wall. That's when I realized something else. They never asked because they didn't want to know. Knowing would mean responsibility. Knowing would mean gratitude. Knowing would mean things might have to change. It was easier to clap for my sister. Easier to believe responsibility was loud and visible and came with speeches. The kind that didn't require looking too closely at where the support was really coming from. That's when I made a second decision. The first had been to stop helping quietly. The second was to stop explaining. I wasn't going to send spreadsheets. I wasn't going to lay everything out and hope for understanding. I wasn't going to beg them to see me differently, because the truth was already there. They just hadn't asked for it. And if they ever did, they could find it the same way I had, by looking. A few days later, my mom called. She sounded casual at first. Asked about my flight. Asked if I'd made it home okay. Then, slowly, the concern crept in. Your dad got a notice about the electric bill. Your sister mentioned the car payment didn't go through. Do you know anything about that? I held the phone in my hand and felt something I hadn't expected. Relief. I'm not sure, I said calmly. I haven't been handling that stuff lately. There was a pause. A long one. Oh, my mom said. Well, okay, we'll figure it out. And that was it. No accusation, no apology, just confusion. But confusion is what happens when a system stops working. And I knew then that the story they'd told themselves, the one where my sister was responsible and I was just fine, was about to run into reality. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I'd finally stopped doing the work that made their version of the truth possible. At first, nothing dramatic happened. That's important to say because people expect fallout to be loud. Explosions, screaming phone calls, accusations. It wasn't like that. It was small things, missed deadlines, confused conversations. A tone shift I recognized immediately. My mom called more often. Not angry, just unsettled. She asked questions she'd never needed to ask before. Do you know when the utility company charges? Did you ever set up autopay for the insurance? Your dad thought something was handled already. Each question landed softly, but together they formed a pattern. Things weren't working anymore. A week after my birthday trip, my sister texted me. Hey, do you know why the car payment didn't go through? I stared at the message longer than I needed to. Normally, I would have responded with a solution, a screenshot, a call to the bank, a quick, I'll fix it. Instead, I typed, I'm not handling that anymore. She didn't reply right away. When she did, it was short. Oh, okay. But I could hear the confusion behind it, the disbelief, the sense that something familiar had shifted without warning. A few days later, my dad called. He didn't mention the dinner. He didn't mention the speech. He talked about logistics. There was an issue with the mortgage paperwork. Something about an authorization. The bank needed clarification. You were listed as the contact, he said. They said you'd know what to do. I closed my eyes for a moment. I'm not involved with that anymore, I said. There was silence on the other end of the line. What do you mean? He asked. I mean, I'm not managing it, I replied. You'll have to talk to the bank directly. He sounded irritated then. Not angry. More inconvenienced. Well, you should have told us, he said. That was the moment. Not when things broke. Not when bills piled up. But when the responsibility shifted and suddenly became noticeable. I didn't argue. I assumed you knew, I said calmly. Another pause. We'll figure it out, he muttered before hanging up. And they did. Just not gracefully. Late fees appeared. Services were interrupted. Calls went unanswered because no one knew who was supposed to make them. My sister complained more. About stress. About how much pressure she was under. About how unfair it was that everything seemed to land on her all of a sudden. It was strange listening to it. This time, I could hear the difference between carrying responsibility and talking about it. One afternoon, my mom called again. Her voice was different. Careful. I didn't realize how much you were doing, she said slowly. You could have said something. I almost laughed. Almost. I tried, I said. At dinner. She didn't respond right away. That wasn't the time, she finally said. I didn't push back. Because we both knew there was never going to be a right time. Over the next few weeks, the narrative started to crack. My sister missed a payment and blamed the system. My dad snapped at a bank representative. My mom apologized for things she couldn't quite name. No one said the words. No one admitted they'd gotten it wrong. But the silence between us changed. Because silence, when it's no longer doing the work, becomes very loud. I wasn't enjoying this. That's another thing people assume. This wasn't revenge. It wasn't satisfaction. It was clarity. I could finally see what my presence, or absence, actually meant. And so could they. By the time my sister called me one night, her voice tight with frustration, asking if I could just help this once, I already knew my answer. I can't, I said. I'm not doing that anymore. She sighed heavily. Well, she said, I guess we'll see who's really responsible now. I didn't respond. Because for the first time, the question didn't bother me. The answer was already unfolding. Things didn't collapse all at once. They unraveled, slowly enough that no one could point to a single moment and say, this is where it went wrong. But fast enough that everyone felt it. By the end of the second month, the tone of every conversation had changed. My sister stopped talking about how busy she was and started talking about how unfair everything felt. How much pressure had suddenly landed on her. How no one appreciated what she was dealing with. I noticed something interesting. She never mentioned me. Not directly. She talked about systems, about stress, about how hard it was to manage everything. But she never said my name. Like saying it might force her to acknowledge where the gap had come from. My dad got quieter. He stopped calling to ask questions and started calling only when he had to. When paperwork needed a signature, when the bank refused to move forward without clarification. Each time I gave the same answer. You'll have to handle that. At first he sounded annoyed. Later he sounded tired. My mom was the only one who changed her approach. She started asking how I was. Not in a performative way, not as small talk. Actually asking. She asked about my job, my apartment, whether I was stressed, whether I was okay. It was subtle, but it mattered. One afternoon, she called and said something she'd never said before. "I didn't realize how much you were carrying," she said quietly. I didn't rush to reassure her. I didn't say, "It's okay," because it wasn't. "I know," I replied. There was a long silence on the line. "I'm sorry," she said eventually. Not loudly, not dramatically, but sincerely. It didn't fix everything, but it shifted something. My sister, on the other hand, doubled down. She complained louder. She framed herself as overwhelmed. She hinted to relatives that I'd changed and wasn't as supportive as I used to be. A few people reached out, not to ask what happened, to suggest I smooth things over. I didn't, because smoothing things over was just another word for resuming my old role. Eventually, the story corrected itself. Not through confrontation, not through confession, through consequence. Bills got paid late instead of early. Problems took longer to solve. Stress became visible instead of absorbed. And slowly, the label my sister had worn so comfortably began to slip. Not because anyone took it away from her, but because it couldn't survive contact with reality. No one ever came back to that birthday dinner and apologized for the applause. No one acknowledged how wrong the moment had been. But they didn't need to, because the truth didn't require a speech. It showed up in every awkward pause, every tense phone call, every moment someone realized things used to work better before. I still see my family, just differently. I show up for holidays, I bring gifts, I stay for dinner. But I don't arrive early anymore. I don't fix seating charts. I don't quietly cover gaps. And I don't correct the story, because I've learned something important. If people only value you when you're useful, they don't actually see you. They see what you provide. That night at my father's birthday dinner, when my sister stood up and took the applause, I thought I'd been erased. I hadn't. I'd been revealed. And once I stopped holding the narrative together, everyone else had to face what responsibility really looked like without me carrying it for them. That was the last thing I ever did for this family without being asked.